junior diplomat, Thomas Reed stood near the refreshment table at the formal reception being held at the Kithaeron Embassy on Earth. Carefully observing senior diplomats navigate the complex social protocols, and trying not to obviously look like he had no idea what he was doing. This was his first major diplomatic assignment after completing his xenolinguistic training program, and his primary function was essentially to observe, learn proper protocols, and avoid creating any international or interspecies incidents through ignorance or cultural insensitivity. The Kithaeryans were relatively recent members of the Alliance, still in the process of building formal relationships with humanity and other spacefaring species. Most interactions maintained somewhat formal professional distance, while both sides learned to navigate cultural differences and establish trust. Thomas had spent the past year studying Kithaeron language and culture as part of his diplomatic preparation. But unlike most human diplomats, who learned only the formal register used in official communications, Thomas had deliberately studied the informal colloquial language that Kithaeryans actually spoke among themselves in casual contexts. It had been considerably more difficult than the formal diplomatic language. The informal register required understanding subtle tonal variations and contextual meanings that didn't translate easily to human linguistic frameworks or cognitive patterns. But Thomas had found the challenge genuinely fascinating, spent hundreds of hours with immersion programs and practice sessions with the relatively few Kithaeron cultural tutors willing to work with humans on informal language instruction. At the reception, Thomas mostly stayed appropriately quiet, observing how the formal Kithaeron being used in diplomatic exchanges differed significantly from the informal colloquial language he'd studied so intensively. He noted pronunciation patterns, tonal variations, the way meaning shifted based on social context. He noticed one particular Kithaeron woman, appearing younger than most of the diplomatic staff, probably junior level like himself, who seemed equally uncomfortable with the rigid formality pervading the event. Her name tag identified her as Velsara, listed as cultural liaison to the embassy. During a lull in the formal proceedings, Thomas found himself standing near her at the refreshment area. She was examining the human food offerings with an expression that suggested polite confusion about what any of it actually was, or how one was supposed to consume it. Thomas, without thinking too carefully about potential protocol implications, spoke to her in fluent informal Kithaeron. The small round items are called cheese puffs. They're essentially flavored air held together by cheese product and human regret. We consume them at social gatherings despite fully knowing they possess no nutritional value whatsoever. We're a somewhat strange species. Velsara's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Her long, elegant ears, the distinctive feature of Kithaeron physiology, snapped to complete attention position, the Kithaeron equivalent of someone physically spinning around in shock. She stared at Thomas with an expression combining utter surprise, visible confusion, and something that might be genuine delight. "You speak Kithaeron," she said, also in the informal register with perfect tonal patterns. "You actually speak it properly. Not the formal diplomatic language that humans usually attempt, but real Kithaeron. How is that possible?" "I studied intensively for a year," Thomas explained, also maintaining informal register. Language immersion programs, cultural tutors, extensive practice sessions. I wanted to actually understand Kithaeryans as people and culture, not just exchange formal diplomatic pleasantries through proper official channels. He realized he might have violated protocol by speaking informally to someone he hadn't been properly introduced to through appropriate diplomatic channels. "I apologize if speaking an informal register is inappropriate given that we haven't been formally introduced. I can switch to formal diplomatic language if that's more proper for this context." "No, please don't," Velsara said quickly, her ears shifting to the position that indicated emphatic preference. "I've been standing here for 2 hours listening to humans speak absolutely terrible formal Kithaeron with atrocious tonal patterns that make their words technically correct, but emotionally meaningless. And watching my fellow Kithaeryans respond in equally rigid formal human, standard with grammar structures that make me want to physically cry. Hearing someone actually speak real Kithaeron, the language I use with my family and friends, is." She paused, searching for the right words. It's wonderful, like hearing home in a room full of strangers performing diplomatic theater. They talked for the next 20 minutes in informal Kithaeron, and Thomas watched Velsara completely transform from the rigidly formal diplomatic persona she'd been carefully maintaining to someone animated, genuinely funny, visibly engaged with their conversation in ways that formal diplomatic exchange never allowed. She asked him detailed questions about his language study process, laughed genuinely when he described some of the early mistakes he'd made while learning tonal variations and contextual meanings, shared her own significant frustrations about learning human languages and navigating human cultural frameworks that often seemed deliberately designed to be confusing. Most humans learn just enough formal Kithaeron to conduct basic diplomatic exchanges and official communications, she explained. They don't bother with informal language because it's substantially harder to master, and they don't perceive the value in investing that effort. But that means every single interaction feels like performing predetermined roles in diplomatic theater, rather than actually talking to real people as individuals. You're genuinely the first human I've met who actually speaks the language I use with my family and close friends. I wanted to understand, not just technically communicate, Thomas said. There's a fundamental difference between conveying information in formally correct ways and actually connecting with people as individuals. The formal diplomatic language accomplishes the first function adequately. The informal language enables the second possibility. As their conversation continued naturally beyond what diplomatic protocols typically allowed, Thomas noticed Velsara's eyes, deep amber color with subtle green patterns that shifted beautifully in the embassy lighting. Kithaeron eyes were biologically distinctive, significantly more complex in structure than human eyes, with enhanced color perception capabilities and visual acuity that he'd read about in xenobiology texts. But he'd never seen Kithaeron eyes quite like Velsara's. The color patterns were unusually intricate, almost hypnotic in the way they caught and reflected ambient light. Without consciously planning the words, responding to genuine appreciation rather than any kind of diplomatic calculation or strategic flattery, Thomas spoke in informal Kithaeron using the specific tonal pattern that linguistically indicated sincere personal observation rather than polite social pleasantry. Your eyes are beautiful. I've studied Kithaeron biology and visual structures extensively, but I've never encountered patterns quite like yours. They're genuinely remarkable. Velsara froze completely. Her ears shifted rapidly through several distinct positions in quick succession. Surprise, confusion, something that looked distinctly like emotional vulnerability. For a long moment, she didn't respond at all, just stared at him with those distinctive eyes, now wide with an expression Thomas couldn't quite interpret through his cultural knowledge. Then she spoke, and her voice was noticeably different, quieter, more careful, with emotional undertones Thomas could hear in the tonal patterns. You said that in perfect, intimate personal register. Do you fully understand what that specific tonal pattern means in Kithaeron cultural context? Thomas's diplomatic training activated immediately with sudden sharp concern that he'd made a terrible cross-cultural error through linguistic ignorance. I use the tonal pattern for sincere personal observation without social filtering. Is that inappropriate? Did I inadvertently communicate something I didn't consciously intend? No, you communicated exactly what you said with complete clarity. That's what's... She paused, clearly processing something significant. In Kithaeron culture, commenting on someone's eyes using intimate personal register with that specific tonal pattern is. It's what you say to people you care about deeply. Close family members, very dear friends, romantic partners, not to relative strangers at formal diplomatic receptions. Thomas felt his face flush with embarrassment. I sincerely apologize. I absolutely didn't mean to be inappropriate or presumptuous. You weren't being inappropriate, Velsara interrupted gently. You were being honest, and honesty expressed through the linguistic patterns that convey genuine, unfiltered emotion is. Her expression had shifted to something Thomas recognized as genuinely moved, perhaps even slightly overwhelmed. Do you know how long I've been stationed on Earth? 8 months. Do you know how many humans have spoken to me in actual Kithaeron during that time? Not formal diplomatic language, but real Kitharin that conveys genuine meaning and emotion. You're the first, the only one. Do you know how many people, human or Kitharin, have said anything genuinely kind about any aspect of who I am as an individual rather than just what I can do for diplomatic relations? Also you, just now. Only you. Thomas and Velsara moved from the crowded main reception area to a quieter alcove where they could continue their conversation without performing for the diplomatic audience or worrying about being overheard by senior staff who might consider informal interaction inappropriate. She explained more comprehensively about Kitharin cultural frameworks around language registers and emotional intimacy. How the formal diplomatic register created necessary professional distance and prevented misunderstandings, but how the informal language with its complex tonal variations allowed for emotional nuance and genuine personal connection that the formal register deliberately and systematically avoided. When you commented on my eyes using intimate personal register, it wasn't culturally inappropriate, she clarified carefully. It was honest and emotionally unfiltered, and honesty expressed through the specific language patterns that convey genuine emotion rather than strategic diplomatic positioning is extraordinarily rare. Especially from humans, who typically don't invest the significant effort required to learn those patterns because they seem unnecessary for professional exchanges. I learned them because I wanted to actually understand Kitharins as complex individuals and as a culture, not just as diplomatic partners or interesting subjects for academic study, Thomas explained. And your eyes genuinely are beautiful. That wasn't strategic compliment or calculated diplomatic flattery designed to build rapport. That was honest observation of something remarkable. I know, Velsara said quietly. I could hear the honesty clearly in your tonal patterns. That's precisely what made it so surprising and emotionally affecting. Her ears were positioned in the expression Thomas had learned through his studies indicated warm affection and genuine appreciation. Most cross-species interactions deliberately stay safely within formal registers, specifically to avoid the emotional vulnerability that comes with honest, unfiltered communication. You bypass that protective barrier completely as if it didn't exist. Should I not have done that? I'm genuinely glad you did. She was quiet for a thoughtful moment. I've been profoundly lonely during my time on Earth. Professionally successful. I'm objectively good at my job, and the cultural liaison work is genuinely important for building sustainable relations. But lonely in the specific way that comes from never having real conversations with anyone, only careful diplomatic performances designed to avoid misunderstanding or giving offense. She met his eyes directly. You speaking to me in real Kitharin, using informal registers that convey genuine emotion, commenting on something personal with obvious honesty rather than calculated flattery. That's the first time in 8 months I've felt actually seen and valued as an individual rather than just professionally utilized as a diplomatic resource. They exchanged contact information, agreed to meet for actual personal conversation rather than formal diplomatic interaction, and began what developed into genuine friendship built on Thomas's willingness to learn Velsara's language properly and her deep appreciation for someone who saw her as a complete person rather than just a useful diplomatic asset. Years later, when asked by junior diplomats and xenolinguistic students about how he developed his widely recognized expertise in Kitharin culture and become one of the most effective human-Kitharin cultural liaisons in the Alliance, Thomas always credited that specific moment. I spoke to Velsara in her language, actual informal Kitharin with proper tonal patterns, not just diplomatic formality designed for safe professional distance. I told her honestly, using intimate personal register, that her eyes were beautiful. She was genuinely surprised because humans typically don't invest the effort to learn those informal patterns, and because no one had spoken to her with that kind of unfiltered honesty in months of diplomatic isolation. He paused. That moment taught me something fundamental about effective cross-cultural work that no amount of formal training could have conveyed. Real diplomacy and genuine cultural understanding aren't primarily about formal protocols and strategic positioning. They're about authentic human, or in this case, Kitharin connection. about seeing people as complete individuals rather than just their professional functions, and communicating with emotional honesty rather than just maintaining careful professional distance. And Velsara's perspective on that encounter, when she spoke to cultural studies students about meaningful cross-species interaction. I'd spent 8 months on Earth feeling professionally utilized and valued for my diplomatic skills, but personally invisible as an individual. Then Thomas spoke to me in real Kithaerin, the informal language I use with family and close friends, not the formal register designed for diplomatic theater and emotional distance. He commented on my eyes using intimate personal tonal patterns that clearly indicated genuine sincere observation rather than strategic flattery calculated to build rapport. Her expression showed the warmth that memory still carried. I was genuinely shocked because humans virtually never invest the significant effort required to learn those informal patterns and their subtle emotional meanings. And because hearing unfiltered honesty after 8 months of carefully performed diplomatic interactions was emotionally overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. That compliment, delivered in the specific language register that conveys authentic emotion, showed me he saw me as a person worth knowing and appreciating rather than just a diplomatic resource worth utilizing for professional purposes. That kind of genuine seeing across species boundaries is rare enough to be genuinely unforgettable. I spoke in the alien woman's language. "Your eyes are beautiful." Her reaction was unforgettable. Became a story they both told about how genuine effort to understand someone's language and culture creates possibilities for authentic connection that formal diplomatic protocols deliberately prevent, and how honest emotional communication can matter more than perfect professional distance when building relationships across species. Thomas had learned the difficult informal language. He'd spoken honestly from genuine appreciation. And Velsara had responded to being seen as a complete person rather than just a professional function, creating a friendship that demonstrated what cross-species understanding could achieve when built on honesty rather than just formal correctness.